My experience is that a lot of this history feeds into also very contemporary discussions about what is it we want with social economic rights today.
You're listening to the Transformative Podcast, brought to you by the Research Center for the History of Transformations at the University of Vienna.
Welcome to the Transformative Podcast. My name is Radka Šustrová. I'm Associate Researcher at the Research Center for History of Transformations. In today's episode, I'm joined by a distinguished guest, Stephen L. Jensen. Stephen is a senior researcher at the Danish Institute for Human Rights. His work focuses on the historical evolution of international human rights diplomacy, and the intersection of global health and human rights. One of his current projects is a political history of economic and social rights in the post-1945 era. Stephen was presently in Vienna as a keynote speaker at the two events co-organized by Work a Just project and the Bruno Kreisky Forum for International Dialogue, both of which focused on advancing social justice in Europe and beyond. Welcome to the podcast, Stephen.
Thank you very much.
Your work at an institution that puts human rights at the center of its mission. Your own research places particular emphasis on social and economic rights, domains that are sometimes viewed as secondary to civil and political rights. How do you see the relationship between these categories and why it's important to bring social and economic rights to the forefront?
There's several reasons for this. First of all, I think economic social rights have always been central to the problem of human rights, which has several implications when you answer the question like that, because that implies that they have a long history. And that also implies that in terms of their substance, they're really critical to how we should understand human rights and what human rights does in societies, whether at a national level or global level, right? So one part is that they have a long history. They were shaping developments back at least in the 18th century, when we get kind of the modern rights story. Questions of education, who pays for what, kind of the economic questions of the broader rights regime were already debated there, including very specific rights elements in the different kind of declarations we have at that time. So historically, they've always been central. Conceptually, I also think that they're central because they have often in different ways interacted with civil political rights and paved a way for civil political rights as well. So it's a dynamic relationship between the categories. It's not an afterthought. It's not something that comes later. And unfortunately, that has been kind of an understanding that has been circulating, especially from the late 70s. And I think it's had a detrimental impact on human rights thinking and broader thinking as well. So for me, my project is very much kind of restoring social economic rights to a history that is appropriate to how things actually unfolded over centuries, not just over decades, but over centuries.
In your keynote in Vienna, you spoke about the post-1945 battle for the social within the institutions like the United Nations and the International Labour Organization. What would you identify as the key turning points or driving forces that kept the social on the international agenda?
So I would say there's two elements here. One is the turning point and one is the forces, right? So for me, a turning point was how important visions or ideas of the social was in the founding moments of the United Nations, in creating this new international organization coming out of not just the major conflict of the Second World War, but the historical experience of the 1930s that had led into that war. It's a paradigm, it's a political vision, it's an way of understanding how do we secure peace in a new era where the social comes in. And part of that turning point, and I think you see that if you look at some of the thinking in 44, 45, even slightly before, the inspiration that comes from the ILO, the International Labour Organization, as a model, like learning from what happened in the labor rights field, in the kind of institutionalization of this organization after the First World War. It's like a model that goes in. So, but for me, it's like a central founding paradigm that the social is really important. So that's the turning point in terms of strengthening international organizations there. But in terms of the forces, I was struck when I was, reading all of this source material in the 40s and the 50s, how central the concept of the social was to thinking across processes of the UN. It was central to the whole ecosystem of this new international organization. And one of the things I've said when I gave my keynote in Vienna was that it's not just about social justice. In some ways, social justice might be an aggregate term for a number of sub-terms or related terms around social welfare, social policy, social planning, social commission as an institutional body of the UN. So we see social development. So we see the social being a really dynamic political concept during this period. And that, I think, is a historical force that leads us that we have to reckon with a form of social internationalism, which was not like an ideological thing. There were certainly ideological versions of socialist internationalism, but social international is a concept that has its own political dynamic inside the deliberations of international diplomacy and international organization. That was what I was trying to get at. And this was a contested concept. There was a battle for that. Also because that centrality that we saw in the 40s and 50s and 60s was not maintained. Part of the story is also political forces undermining the centrality of the social from the 1970s forward, which is the kind of the neoliberal moment going forward. And there's simply a driving force behind some visions and imaginaries that were founding for the UN and influenced the dynamic.
You also emphasize the role of that socialist and global south countries played in bringing issues like inequality and discrimination to the forefront of international debate. How did they advocacy reshape the priorities of the international human rights discourse? And was this, in your view, an act of resistance against Western dominance?
There's several interesting elements here because I think the socialist countries and the global south countries, at times they had overlapping interests and issues, but I think they were also separate actors with different visions and different interests. So they influenced things in different ways. And clearly there was an interest from the socialist states around social and economic issues. Sometimes that had limitations because they were not always interested in letting the human rights framework devolve into an accountability framework where legal standards were binding on states. So there's sometimes a limitation on the socialist contribution. In terms of the global south, they had, of course, huge interest in that because they were trying to build new nations out of an experience of long-standing colonialism. So they both had an emphasis on political matters, on economic matters, and social matters. And they were often like a driving force of expanding this concept. Of course, sometimes they did it in resistance to the West, but we should be careful not just putting them as a reactive bloc. For me, often they did that in a way which was about ordering, like what type of international organization did they want? What should international diplomacy be about across the different range? So instead of just seeing them as reactive or in a resistance to the West, I think they were sometimes the drivers of forms of ordering, which I think we see very clearly play out in the human rights domain. I'm pretty sure we see it in a range of other domains around social policy. You mentioned inequality. Making that as a kind of an issue at the UN was often coming from the global south. So in a sense, I think we should see they had visions of order. And this is why they had this emphasis on why the social was important in the international.
Would it be fair to say that during the Cold War, socialist and global south countries succeeded in reframing the discourse on social rights within international debates?
I think so, at different levels and across different organizations. Because they were both active at kind of your higher level organs of the General Assembly, but also, of course, active in the different UN agencies. So whether it was health through WHO or labor in ILO or education, science, culture at UNESCO, they had policy agendas and aims that they were pushing through there. But also at a higher level, is this way of making the social central to international politics is clearly a way of reshaping and challenging and making sure that colonial territories were part of discussions, like evidence from them were brought in to discussion at the UN, where the metropoles, the colonial powers, were trying to keep that away. So just in terms of drivers of universality inside this new organization, in terms of what is our conversation about, where do we draw evidence, what do we look at, what political issues comes in, I think that was one way of reframing it. And of course, also specifically on the rights issue, that the way they get articulated.
You co-edited the volume Social Rights and the Politics of Obligation in History, published by Cambridge University Press in 2022. And this book moves beyond the 20th century to explore the deeper historical roots of the social and economic rights. What does this longer historical perspective reveal about the nature of these rights and their place in political and social transformation?
I think I'm very keen to make sure that we understand the social economic rights within the international human rights framework as having a longer story, as I mentioned before, but also that we really understand how these human rights standards relate to a larger history of, for example, welfare societies, welfare state, and social reforms under that. Because I don't think that welfare state, social economic rights, and international human rights related to economic are necessarily the same. I would say that there's a limitation in scope to the human rights part, but there's a historical continuation, there's a historical experience, and the way that social economic rights, human rights inside the post-45 framework, they relate to experiences and processes at the domestic level. So as well as we go back in time and understand the deeper historical roots, we should also understand that this is not like an international law story of trickle down. This is a story shaped by domestic histories and national processes that feeds up and shape our international frameworks. And I think just if you look at the history of health and social medicine, I'm very inspired by the German doctor Rudolf Virchow, who became a prominent liberal politician in the second half of the 19th century in Germany. I mean, his visions of health and human rights in 1848, I mean, they're incredible. They're extremely elaborate. They're foundational for like social medicine, but they've also been a huge inspiration from some of the most important global health work that's been happening in the last few issues. So we can't understand health and human rights work today by just taking something out of a UN covenant. We have to understand an almost 200-year history of the whole shaping of the public health field. So it's also, in a sense, staying true to a historical record, but also capturing historical transformation over time to understand where the social economic rights fit into that aspect.
Zooming in on the 20th century, what would you highlight as the most transformative moments in the global history of social and economic rights? Are there particular episodes or actors that you feel deserve greater recognition?
Yes, I want to share one specific episode that I'm very interested about. And it's also very timely because right now our whole international community is in crisis and the UN will face like massive reform and reduction and so on. So there's like organizational change going on at the UN. So I've looked at the very first organizational efficiency review at the United Nations, which took place in 1951 and 52. So the whole idea was already at this point, there was too many meetings at the UN. There was too much to prepare for. It wasn't efficient and so on. So they're looking at a process to reduce that. Only when you look at that process, you see that it's not just a kind of an administrative way of making the UN slightly more effective. It's a political process by which the United Kingdom and United States wanted to close down the human rights structures at the UN. So the Commission on Human Rights, the Commission on the Status of Women, and one of the human rights expert bodies that fed into that work. So what they were doing was trying to, in a sense, smother or kill human rights at the very early stage of the UN. And what becomes the rescue effort? It's global South countries that go up against and beat this reform idea from the US and the UK, that they emphasize to resuscitate the human rights work at UN to social and economic rights, the right to education and the right to work. And that becomes two of the early human rights conventions from UNESCO and ILO. For me, this is very transformative because this is like a resuscitation of human rights work after a near-death experience. That's a big example of how social economic rights influence what is really a global history beyond the UN rights framework, beyond international organization, beyond international diplomacy, in a sense, a protection of a certain vision of 20th century political order.
So, your research adopts a truly global perspective, connecting developments in Europe with those in the global south. Could you tell us more about your current research and how it continues to expand this global lens on social rights and internationalism?
I think there's been a lot of work for us to do in the field of human rights history, which has really evolved over the last decade and a half, because let's say 15 years ago, it was very Western focused, and that was very limiting. And that meant the human rights history has gone through different stages of, like, we've had historiographical debates, reflection. We've just moved into methodology, but now we're actually seeing human rights history inspiring human rights practice around the world today. And I think there's some real importance in getting the social economic rights story into these wider frames. So we have a better understanding, a better appreciation of that history. So that's what I'm trying to do with my book project, which is trying to write a history of social economic rights in 20th century international politics. And it tries to show many connections in time and space. My experience is that a lot of this history feeds into also very contemporary discussions about what is it we want with social economic rights today. How do we want to tackle inequalities? These, in a sense, this vision of simply creating a different baseline of understanding when we talk about these issues, because for decades we had interpretations that we just reproduced that appeared to be not well grounded in history and sometimes a real distortion. So it's not a question of just revising, it's actually changing the basis of the conversation. I think this is one of the contributions that history can make to many types of debates in our contemporary times.
Lots of work ahead. Stephen, thank you so much for this insightful conversation. It's been a pleasure to having you on the Transformative Podcast.
It's been a pleasure to talk to you and a pleasure to be in Vienna.